You know, we've talked about your musical history in the past, and you mentioned that although you had music growing up, and you've already said that in this interview, it was music around the house.
Mhm.
That a particular experience that involved our archive at the Library of Congress um, really got you on the path to folk music. So why don't you tell us about that? Because that's a fun story.
My beloved partner, spouse, Elizabeth Minnick, public philosopher, feminist, educator, author, who I fell in love with in the 11th grade. Um, I lost my train because I started thinking about her. Where were we? Okay, so first I have to correct. Yes, of course. When I was in SNCC,
Oh,
I
right, because you were joking. Yeah. Okay. So
yeah, there was
yeah. So explain that
music
first. Yeah.
everywhere. But that's where I learned the importance of music um, in struggles for social justice. We can go back to that or not. No, here's what happened. It's a great. I'm like, I want to say, oh, Steve, do I have to tell that story again? But it's a true
This is
story.
exactly where we want you to get that
Yeah,
story recorded.
right. So, I mean, somewhere very early in my music career, such as it is, um, because I'm not a careerist in music. I mean, so many people think, oh, what does it feel like to have been a full time musician for all these years? I'm like, no, no, no. I'm a full time civil rights union and community organizer. That is how I've earned my living for 55 years. I'm retired on a union pension, still doing organizing work. I once told a reporter that my music was a hobby that got out of hand. It's completely true. I made my first album when I was 30 years old, never having performed in public except for leading Solidarity Forever. But everybody knows the words, so you just like peace, you just stick your hand in the air and strum a chord, and everybody sings. And I made my first public performance at the age of 35 at the University of Chicago Folk Festival. That's a long story. Perhaps we'll get to it. Maybe we will. So I did tell a reporter that my music was a hobby that got out of hand. This is completely true. Um, when I was, I guess, just 15, we moved from State College. Pop got a promotion, and we moved to Chevy Chase, Maryland, and um, and I attended Bethesda Chevy Chase High School, affectionately known as BCC, where Peggy Seeger went to school like 8 years before me, and Jane Gilman and Dan Schatz. It's just kind of cool. And one day, our English teacher assigned us to write an essay based on research at the Library of Congress. So there I am. I take the bus down there. I'm at the Library of Congress. You know, it's not a model of architectural creativity. Right? It's sort of like kind of bleak hallways. And in those days, um, the sign today, generally speaking, an office has a sign on the door, flat on the door. In those days, the signs stuck out from the wall. They were usually on Bakelite, but you could see them walking down the hall. You didn't have to turn your head to look at what was on the door. And I see this sign that says Archive of Folk Music, right? I'm like, oh, right. Joan Baez. I'll bet they've got some Joan Baez, right? So maybe even some Kingston Trio. Who knows? So I walked in, and there was some nice people. I said, "You guys got any Joan Baez?" And they were very patient. I said, "Well, no, actually, that's not what we. She's a wonderful artist, but that's not what we do." So what do you do? They said, "Well, we are the national repository for field recordings." I said, "What's a field recording?" They say, "Well, we send people out with tape recorders to every community in the United States and in some cases around the world, and they record the music of that group, whether it's a Native American nation, whether it's an ethnic community. Um, we don't care. We don't care what kind of music it is, as long as it's traditional." And I said, "So what does this music sound like?"
Mhm.
And they said, "Well, here, check it out." And they had, I don't know if they're pictures from that day. I'd love to see them. My memory is that as you walked in, there was a counter ahead of you with a couple people behind it, and to the right were what were called listening booths, but they weren't like the slick things that they had today. They kind of cobbled together with plywood, didn't even bother to fish out the edges, and they had record changers. I'm not going to explain all the ancient technology. So they gave me an album. They gave me an LP, a long playing record, 12 inches round, hole in the middle. And what was so cool about them is that they were red plastic, and you could see through them. I mean, they were translucent. You couldn't actually see anything, but you could see light through them.
Hmm.
And I put it on the turntable, dropped the arm with a needle, and I like to use the biblical phrase, the scales fell from my eyes. Now, you have pointed out to me that I've consolidated my memory of half a dozen Library of Congress records into one. But I don't. What I remember, and I know I'm wrong about the order, is that I had an album called, what I was listening to in the archive was an album called A Southern Sampler, and I think you tell me if I'm wrong about this. I think it starts with some old geezer tuning his fiddle, right? He goes. I thought, how cool is that? Is that true?
Actually, I don't know Southern Sampler per se. As you said,
Well, it turns out
when
that
you described it to me before, it sounded like more than one album. Possibly.
yeah, no, I think you're right. And but somewhere, and I brought over time. I that was basically what I owned. That was my record collection. I got up to about 30 of them, right? But in the recordings that I brought home, that I acquired over the years, I heard some of the absolutely traditional roots of music in the United States. I heard McKinley Morganfield, not a name people know, because that's when he was living in Mississippi and playing Delta blues. And later he went to Chicago and became Muddy Waters, right? And I heard Pete Steele playing the 5-string banjo and doing the Coal Creek March. And I think it was, I heard, you'll help me on this, the name just escapes me, who did Another Man Done Gone. Who is that, Steve?
Well, a number of people did it, but Vera Hall might be the.
Yeah. And who Alan Lomax, the great collector, said had the purest voice that he'd ever recorded. I heard Sin Killer Griffin. The congregation that I used to think was Angola State Prison. I think it was actually a different one. And then he sings, wasn't that a mighty storm? Wasn't that a mighty storm with the water? Wasn't that a mighty storm that blew the people all away, about the great Galveston flood? I heard fiddle tunes, Haste to the Wedding, Off She Goes. And I fell in love with this music. This is what I think my favorite part is. I brought whatever album it was, I brought home. I was so excited, and my parents were like, I had good parents. They're good liberal parents, raised on Dr. Spock, not Spock, Spock, and they said, what are you so excited about? I said, I've just discovered the most wonderful music in the entire world. They're like, that's great. We'd love to hear it. So, I put it on, and I don't know. I do still remember the look of pain. Here are my classically trained, opera-loving parents, and here's, some old geezer screeching away. But good liberal parents, they said, we're so glad you found something that you really liked here. I'm sure they went into the bedroom and beat their breasts and said, what did we do wrong? Where did we go wrong? Right. But yeah, I mean, this is, and that is the music that shaped my music today. And, I don't know, very early when I started, doing the occasional concert, somebody wrote that Cy's major influences are Tom Paxton, Pete Seeger, and Woody Guthrie. Nobody asked me. I just said that, right? I have never been able to shake that. They are all wonderful artists. They are great artists, and I love their music. But that's not my influences. That's not the roots of my music. Um, and I mean, someday I hope some scholar will do a book not about me, but about my music, because I have tried to preserve and carry on this extraordinary, wonderful, precious national resource that you folks at the Library of Congress guard. I don't think you're armed guards. I hope not.
Well, we
But
have our,
you are the guardians of this extraordinary heritage, and it's okay. So one of the riffs that I was using in concerts. Remember concerts?
yeah, those were fun, weren't they?
Yeah. I would say, well, I'm sorry to have to make this announcement tonight, but I want to formally announce that I am no longer a candidate for president of the United States. The audience knew to groan. Oh no, say it isn't so. So I said, no, yes, I've just decided it's not my career path anymore. I said, I do feel somewhat liberated. My partly because I wanted to institute as your president, I wanted to institute a national good jobs for all program where everybody could have a good job with, health insurance and a pension plan and parental leave and union representation. So I'm sorry I can't do that. I hope one of our presidents does. So what I'm doing instead as a civilian is good jobs for ethnomusicologists. Right. People laugh. I'm like, yeah. I said, so what I've done is if you look at my body of work, which is pretty large, I mean, I have no idea how many songs there are, but it's probably at least close to 1,000 or something like that, of which about 300 have been recorded by me and other people. I said, so in my songs, I have hidden the musical equivalent of literary references. So in a song, I might have 4 notes that I took from a traditional song. I might have 3 words that I took from a traditional song. I said, there's probably 100 songs like that. And I believe that 5 ethnomusicologists can be employed for at least 3 years trying to find them all, right? So, but this is true. And I'm not even sure where they're all, but here's an example, because I was writing to somebody last night. I have a song called Wigan Pier. So there's some of your listeners will know that George Orwell wrote a book called The Road to Wigan Pier as a journalist in England, after, by the way, being a colonial policeman in Burma, then a British colony. He wrote this book where he described the working lives of miners, and it was actually a wake-up call in the UK, because people weren't paying attention to how bad these words were. So in the song, the chorus goes, who will stand and who remember, who still hears that whistle blow, who will wait beside the window for the black-faced miner coming down the road, right? And I wrote to this wonderful British group, the Youngins, saying, I'll bet you know where the black-faced miner coming down the road, where I stole that, right? Do you know?
Black Leg Miner.
No, not Black Miner. That's a different tune, but that's a good guess.
I don't know the one. Yeah.
It says, "You for my dark-eyed sailor."
Oh,
My dark-eyed sailor. I do this all
the
over.
melody. I was thinking the words. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you were thinking, well, that's good. Black Leg Miner is a great song. I sing it. So I mean, that's one of the ways in which I honor tradition. I use the structures of tradition, including, by the way, of what I learned growing up in the synagogue. I knew what are called acrostics, where, and this is you see this in a lot of the Hebrew liturgical poets, that if you go down the left-hand margin or the right-hand margin in the case of Hebrew,
Right.
it spells something out.
Right.
So when I do a wedding song for friends, it'll say, like, Michelle and Ken have a great marriage. And it's really I had one where there was an X in one of the, the couple's names. Boy, that was tough.
That's tough. Yeah.
That's tough. So, and I still sing so many of the old songs, and I listen to some of the old songs, and I think one time Utah Phillips, who I really miss, was introducing me at the Champlain Valley Folk Festival. Pretty cool honor to have Utah Phillips introducing you. He said, and this is, I'm paraphrasing, but Utah said something like, he said, we live in an age of truly great songwriters. He said, it's a golden age for songwriting. Oh, by the way, I am not a singer-songwriter. I'm a songwriter. Singer-songwriters write songs primarily for themselves to perform. I have no problem with it. It's a great thing. I write songs for other people to perform. I am forced to perform them because otherwise how would other people learn them? But I'm just a songwriter, right? So he said, so many of the great writers today are not rooted in the tradition. He said their models are pop and rock. He said there's nothing wrong with it. And I want to emphasize that they are great writers, but one of the things that Si and I share is our roots are in the tradition. And I do think that I'm certainly not the only one, but I do think that that's a characteristic. So if the question is, what are my influences? First, it is the music that the Library of Congress preserves from many different traditions. And then if I have to name a person, it's not even a musician. It's the great Irish poet, William Butler Yeats. Okay. And I've said, and I actually mean that I aspire to write with just some small portion of the grace and power with which he uses the English language. And that's really my model. That's because I when I was young, you remember the Cooter preference test? It's not the Kruger preference test, because everybody prefers the Kruger brothers. This was something they gave you in the 11th grade to help you figure out what you should do for a career, right? So, they had like, I don't know, 50 different jobs you could do. And basically I had this straight line across the middle. One peak was corporate executive and the other peak was poet, and I actually think I've kind of done both. I've, run organizations and campaigns, but I set out to be a poet, and that's what I studied. And then later, I guess both because I love music and because I figured out who reads poetry, who listens to music, Well, yeah, but for me, the words, there's nothing more important than the words. Of course, the tunes matter, but I hope that my lyrics are poetic, and I really aspire to that.
Well, I love that you mentioned Yeats because, of course, Yeats was heavily influenced by traditional song, and some of his poems are really rewritings of old Irish folk songs. So it's the same, I think what people are recognizing when they say that your influences are Tom Paxton and Woody Guthrie, etc., even though they're technically wrong, what they're recognizing is that those people's influences are the same as your influences. And so there's a resemblance between what you do.
Yeah.
And what all people do.
I sort of, again, I love these guys. They're great. But I wish that in the list that they had included not just white guys.
Yeah.
I mean, where do you start? Where do you even start? And I have, well, actually, I no longer have a collection of LPs because our youngest son of 3, whose performing name is Brycon. He's a hip hop artist and producer. And one day he came into my office and looked into the approximately 800 LPs, most of which have been given to me by friends, except for the ones that you guys made me pay for. And he said, "Hey, Pops, you listen to this stuff anymore?" I'm like, "Honey, I don't even have anything to play them on." He said, "How about if I take them off your hands?" I'm like, "Honey, with all due respect, why do you want my Ralph Stanley records? Why do you want my Bill Monroe records? Why do you want my original Bog Trotters? Or I actually had the original RCA issue of Robert Johnson, from the '60s.
Yeah, yeah.
Became popular. I said, why do you want this stuff? He said, Pops, you've got beats no one else has got. Right? Right. And every once in a while, I'm like, I'll be listening to some of his work and I'm like, hey, is that Wade Ward? He said, yep, sure is. Right. It's what I love about hip hop is it's a musical library of references, and Gabe and I actually we worked together, we performed together. This is so one time there's a wonderful festival near Stanton, Virginia. It's spelled Staunton, but it's really pronounced Stanton.
Right.
I can't remember the name of it, but it's the family of Francis Collins, who, not Floyd Collins, Francis Collins, who is the head of the National Institute of Health. Did you know that?
Nice. Excellent.
Yeah. He's a great Carter picker. He's a very nice guy. So his family has this farm, and they do once a year they do a festival limited to 300 people. So I was talking to one of the Collinses, and I'd never played the festival before. And I said, so, how do you do this? He says, well, Friday night is youth night because we're trying to achieve some continuity. We're trying to bring younger people in to be loyal festival goers. I said, well, I've actually got a lot of kids songs. I said, no, not kids, teenagers. And I said, our youngest is a hip hop artist and we do stuff together. How would you feel about that? They're like, our kids will love it. Our kids will love it. Right. So they were very nice. So they because Gabe and I had worked together in a while, we hadn't performed together in a while. So they got us a house out in the country, and Elizabeth came too. And, Gabe and I polished our act. And then, Friday afternoon, he set up, there's the turntables and there's this big speakers on this little folk stage, right? And the Roz Collins, who's the festival director, came up to me laughing hysterically. I'm like, what's so funny, Roz? He says, oh, I just got one of a phone call from one of our oldest members. I'm like, well, and she said, well, he called up and he said, Roz, I understand that there are turntables on our stage. What in the hell is going on? Right? But yeah, I'm not just rooted in, the white music of this country. I think far too many artists are not aware of the African American roots of what passes for white music. I mean, and I also don't automatically diminish white tradition. I mean, I learned from, Samantha Bumgarner and the stuff that you guys put out. Thank you. Right. So yeah, I mean that's. But yeah, and sometimes I'll introduce a song of mine by reciting a Yeats poem. For example, there's a poem. I think it was for Major Robert Gregory called "An Irish Airman Foresees His Death." That's what it says. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere amidst the clouds above. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. My country is Kiltartan Cross. My countrymen, Kiltartan's poor. No likely turn could bring them loss or leave them happier than before. Nor love nor duty bade me fight, nor public men, nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to life. The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath, the years behind, in balance with this life, this death. And then I sing a song called First Time at a War, about a kid from Eastern Kentucky who lies about his age, ends up in the trenches of World War I, and then ends up in a VA home, and the chorus is, you know, don't don't you play no sad songs on the jukebox. I've heard them all 100 times before. And excuse me if I seem a little crazy. You see, this is my first time at a war. So, I like the integration of all of this. And, and the integration of art, I remember that it's, I cannot remember in Chicago. I'm struggling to remember her name. She's gone now. But a wonderful artist in charcoal who, while I played, would create a pastel drawing to illustrate the songs. Peggy, I don't remember. I get some excuses for being 76 years old. Actually, I've never been good with names, but that's okay because I'm bad with faces.
All right. Well, we're sort of homing in on the beginning of your musical career. You had mentioned that you started performing at 35, but that you started sort of recording and writing your songs a little earlier than that. So how did you start as a songwriter? How did you start putting together these words and music that you had in your head?
I don't really know. After Pop died, and we were cleaning up his house, the one thing I wanted to find was my kindergarten report card. And even though I've never found it, I still hope to. I've got unsorted boxes from his place. The teacher had written, "Cy has written a little song, and we are teaching it to the class. We hope to encourage him in this activity." I love it, right?
That's great.
I think from sort of my late teenage years, there's a couple of songs that I wrote, one when hitchhiking around the country looking for folk musicians. And then I told you that I told a reporter my hobby was a music that got out of hand, which is true. I am a passionate fan of music. I still am. I used to go to fiddlers conventions and sleep in the back door of my back seat of my Aunt Reba's '53 Chevy and stay up all night and indulge in the evil spirits to an extreme extent. And one time I decided I wanted to join a jam, and I made a washed up bass. And after the first song, they said, "Oh, would you mind not playing? You're throwing us all off," right? But I was going to listen, and then somewhere in my late 20s, I just started writing songs. I think that maybe there are 4 or 5 songs prior to that. I don't know. I don't even know what they are, and they just started pouring out. A lot of them were for the kids. That we at that point, I think we had 2 kids. And I was writing songs for them, to sing to them. But I never meant to do it. I just started doing it. And, some of the songs of mine that have gone as the Scots descendants in Eastern North Carolina say, oot and a boot. They've got oot and a boot, I would say that between 25 and 30, I wrote Gone Gonna Rise Again. I know I wrote Aragon Mill.
Yeah.
Now, some of those, and I don't remember who this was. At one time, somebody said to me, "Cy, if you had only been a full-time musician instead of all this organizing stuff, think how many more songs you might have written." Right? Now, usually I think of the answer 3 days later, right? I come up with really great answers, but not on the moment. But without thinking, I said, "Yeah, but what would they have been about?" So many of my songs come out of situations in my life. I think this is true of many songwriters. Last night I was reading this great interview with Bruce Springsteen in the AARP magazine. What? Youth hero? It's a very, very thoughtful, really good interview. He's 71 years old. When did that happen, right? But and so it's not that just that they come out of political situations, but I will put my love songs, mostly for Elizabeth. Um, I'll put them up against anybody's love songs. I don't. I'm I get. I don't like being labeled as a political songwriter. It's a way of marginalizing, right?
Hmm.
Me and all the other. And I have this riff. I do interviews and radio shows. And here's a typical recreation, right? So, Cy, you're a political songwriter. I'm like, well, keep going. They said, well, basically, you write protest songs. I said, well, actually, if you ask me, there's far more things that I'm for than things I'm against. Would you like to hear what some of them are? I said, no, but okay, but all right. So, but you are a struggle songwriter. I'm like, have you ever tried writing songs? It's a real struggle. And then they say, okay, topical songwriter. I said, no. You're thinking of Jimmy Buffett. That always pays me 30 seconds, right? And then I say, listen, all songwriters, all artists are political. The question is, what politics do we support? What politics do we criticize, oppose? And where are we simply silent? I said, for example, do you consider Guns N' Roses to be a political band? They said, of course not. And what do you consider them to be? I said, good rock and roll. I'm like, do you think they have political points of views? He says, never thought about it. I says, well, they've been pretty misogynist and homophobic. And I don't use big words like that. I'm like, don't you consider those political points of view? And they're like, wow, I never really thought about it. I said, look, it's great music, but there is a political point of view there. And for me to be, if you want to use the term political songwriter, I will admit to it. If we admit that all songwriters are political, and secondly, that all music has a point of view. And if we are silent on the issues of our day, we've taken a stand. I like back when it was just gay and lesbian, before we quite appropriately expanded it. I mean, the slogan "silence equals death" during the AIDS epidemic. Yes, it does. If you don't speak out against racism, if you don't speak out about violence, if you don't speak out about all the things that need to be spoken about, yeah, you've taken a stand. You're being political. But to me, to be and Steve, this is just a definition I've come up in the last year or two, is to be an artist is to refuse self-censorship, right? To refuse self-censorship. And when I'm in a humorous mood, I say, the censors need those jobs. That's how they support their families. So, let them decide that they're going to blacklist you. Let them decide they're going to ban you from the radio. Don't do their work for them. And I really think that's important. I try to write about the whole of life, right? Like I said earlier, I'll put my love songs for Elizabeth up against anybody else. I have written, you probably know Matt Watroba.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Matt's he's a DJ in the Detroit area, and a wonderful performer, but he does community sings in the Pete Seeger tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of just getting everybody to sing together. So, so I gave Matt a large number of my songs after he came to Charlotte and did a community sing, and he did an album that I've wanted somebody to do for years. The cartoon The Far Side.
Mm-hmm.
This album is called The Far Side.
Right, The Far Side. I remember that. Yeah.
Right. The Cy-Con funny song, sing along song. They're some people have said that some of the songs have socially redeeming value. I don't really think so. And the test for inclusion is you have to go like, oh, please tell me Cy-Con didn't really write that song.
Right.
I think that's our responsibility. Joy is a political act. Love is a political act. Humor is a political act. And in hard times like we're going through now, like so often we're going through, what's better than to give people a chance to for a good belly laugh. I think that's a political act. I write historical songs. I write songs. I just found a couple tapes with about 80 or 90 children's songs. I've just got studios out there in Charlotte. I go to, folks for years. They just transcribed them onto digital, and I'll see what's there. Um, but I think that I would encourage songwriters, write about everything. Don't. And I'll tell you another story. And I'm not going to name, but I was at a festival, and one of the headliners said, "Can I talk to you?" I'm like, "Of course you can. I'd love to talk with you." So we were off privately, and this person said, "You know, I think I'm a pretty good songwriter. I think I'm a pretty good guitarist. I think I'm a pretty good singer. And I frankly, don't understand why I'm not more popular." And I thought maybe you could help me figure that out. I said, "Oh, I know the answer." I said, "I can tell you." They said, "You do? What is it?" I said, "Well, I hate to say this, but you're terminally depressing." And they said, "Really?" I said, "Look, I admire your political commitments. I do. They're wonderful. But in performance, you like you start by talking about child sexual slavery, and then you do a song about child sexual slavery, and then you comment on the song, and then you move on and you do something about the fate of the earth and how dolphins are dying." I said, "Don't you know any love songs?" And they said, "Actually, no." I said, "Go write some. Go write some." I said, I said, "I want to be clear. You're a wonderful guitarist, a wonderful vocalist, a wonderful songwriter, and you have beautiful political commitments. But you can't dump the whole lot on people. You got to let them laugh. You got to give them an experience of joy." And I saw him like 5 years later, and he said, "You were right. You were right." I said, "Right. And you can still get that message, but if it's too much, people shut themselves out." So I try to do it all. I try to, and I believe that whatever political messages we want to give people, we're entertainers. People didn't come to our concert. If they come to our concert, they didn't come to get a lecture on morality or to be told everything they're doing wrong. They came to be entertained. And that's our job. And somebody said to me once, "What's your goal at a concert?" I said, "Well, if it goes really right, and if two people came together, I want them to walk out, and one of them says to the other, I really love you." And I'm serious about that.
Mhm. So how did you start actually as a performer? Because now you're talking about all the stuff that you've learned
Yeah.
as a performer over the years, but at some point you were brand new to it. So how did that start?
Oh, it's good. It's um, so when I was 30, I told you when I was 30, I made this album. It's actually kind of so Jack Wright, who was at Apple Shop, the great Appalachian Cultural Center in Weisburg, Kentucky, called me up and said, "Hey, how would you like to make a record album?" I'm like 29 years old. I'm like, "Jack, what are you talking about?" He says, "How would you like to make a record album?" I'm like, that seems to be a little crazy." He said, "Why?" I said, "Well, first, I'm not a musician." He said, "No, no, no. I heard that tape that you made of some of your songs that was getting passed around. And, um, yeah, I think you are a musician." I said, "Okay, you don't have a record company." And he's like, "Well, I didn't, but I was sitting in the offices of the Lilly Foundation in Indianapolis in this last 2 weeks of the year, and turned out that they had made a bookkeeping error, and they were going to have to pay the government $6 million if they didn't give it away. So they were pushing it out the door." And he said, they had already given me all the money I'd asked for Apple Shop, and they said, "Well, isn't there something else that you need money for?" I mean, imagine, right? And Jack said, "Well, I've always wanted to do a record album that would record the music of Appalachia." I said, "Great idea, just what we're looking for. Where's the proposal?" He said, "Well, no, there's no proposal. I haven't really, it's just kind of an idea. I've never, really." I said, "Well, can you type?" He said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "Go in that room, type up a one-page proposal." He walked off with $250,000 to start doing Apple records, right? Yeah. So yeah, so and I actually thought it was a joke, but it wasn't. And in I think it was September of what 1974, um, we gathered in Wise, Virginia, in the coal fields where I was no where Wise or in Norton, one of them, where I had heard Ralph Stanley with Jack Cook on bass play to an audience of like 25 people in the upstairs room of a restaurant, right? And nobody had ever made an album before. The recording engineer, said slightly kindly, a wonderful guy named Gary Slem, who was a DJ, the local commercial station, and he did jingles for the supermarkets. So he had a 4-track TAC recorder and one microphone, and none of us had ever done. I don't think any of us. It was Jack was there. John McCutcheon was 21. Rich Kirby, John Sundell, Sonny Houston. I hope I'm not leaving anybody out. And we, it's a 7-track recording. Not many 7-track recordings out there. So what we did is we first Gary got me to record 16 guitar tracks. There's one unaccompanied, one a cappella song, Lawrence Jones, about a miner murdered on the Brookside picket line, but the other 16 songs got a guitar. Steve, I don't know if you've ever tried to record guitar tracks without singing, without whispering under your breath. It's really hard, right? So we had this assembly line. So then I did that. Then I sang the 17, vocal tracks to 16 to the guitar. And then I went out back and we had an assembly line, with a gigantic cooler of beer. And, as it became the turn for people to, play or Rich Kirby to play mandolin, or for, McCutcheon to play hammer dulcimer, I would teach them the song. Then they'd go in and record, right? Oh, and so I did on the first. So we got a 4-track recorder. First track by guitar, second track by my vocal, third Sonny Houston on electric bass. Nobody ever figured out it was an electric bass. They were, and one of the reviews says just the friends, just the sound of good friends gathered around a single microphone playing together. No, not exactly. So then I didn't understand what was going
What was
on.
the sound of that? It just wasn't actually put together that way, right?
Yeah. So then Gary mixed the 3 tracks down to the 4th track. Okay, you with me?
Yeah.
Right? Then he wiped the first 3 tracks clean, and then McCutcheon's hammer dulcimer would go on, Rich Kirby's mandolin and harmony would go on. So it's actually a 7-track recording, right? It was fun. It was such fun, right? And I mean this. So it came out in 1975, and I think I was just really lucky in terms of when it came out, because that's just first. That's when the alternative record companies were starting. Flying Fish was a couple years old. Rounder was a couple years old. Our Holy, you name it. And when alternative radio was starting, we were just getting community stations, listener supported, pirate, Suitcase. NPR was just starting. So there wasn't a lot of product. There wasn't. I mean, today my DJ friends say, yeah, I get 50 to 100 CDs a week.
It's true, yeah.
Probably in those days it was 50 or 60 a year. So the albums got a lot of great airplay.